been almost 4 years since we all got word that we were experiencing a global pandemic and we were to head home. And since then, you've had a hunch that things might not go well for kids or for schools. You knew, whether you were a parent, a teacher, or a regular Canadian, that the immediate and the longer-term impact of cloistering all students in their own homes for extended periods of time without real external supports was going to be significant. You were correct, and you still are. What we are seeing in elementary and secondary education today is markedly different from what we could have observed even just 4 or 5 years ago. And it is certainly different from when you sent your kids to school or when we went to school ourselves. Absenteeism is up. Achievement is in decline. Violence in schools is growing. Teacher retention is in free fall. A few dominant ideologies reign. Regard for history is low. Bans on books are on the rise. Mental well-being is down. Anxiety is up, and learning loss is real. But there is hope. Beautiful changes are happening too. So let's take a walk over to the window, throw open the shutters, and take a look. And what we're seeing is nothing short of dramatic. Taken together, the changes in the alternatives to the K-12 public schooling are staggering. Enrollments are up in most independent schools in the country. Wait lists are now common, and homeschooling uptick is significant. And not only are enrollments up, but more independent and private schools are opening than ever. And more types of schools and approaches to schooling are available. First, different curricular content is blooming. Think forest schools or arts-based schools. But then there's also different delivery approaches that are on the rise. Think hybrid schools, think micro schools, learning pods, part-time at home, part-time at school. And then consider the spaces that are being used for schools now. Public spaces, community centers, religious hubs, all being multi-purpose so that they can be sites for K-12 education during the weekdays. Now I've got a unique position as leader of a vibrant industry association here in Ontario. And I and my team get phone calls that the average person wouldn't get. But together, they add up to a trend. And I'd like to give you a peek into those calls. I'm thinking about my conversation with William a few weeks ago. He's lead pastor of a thriving church with thousands of weekly worshipers. They recently opened a daycare for 75, hit capacity, and have more than 300 children on their wait list. Well, we're thinking of opening a JK to 6 school, he said in our Zoom call. We already have a dance studio, we've got a tech studio, we've got a multi-purpose gymnasium, we've got classrooms. Do you mind if I just bounce some of my ideas off of you? So then we discussed curriculum, with lots of space for experiential learning. We discussed what the parental roles would be, what the roles would be for teachers, how it could be governed. And in the end, his biggest question to me was, do you think we can get this up and running by September 24? Or what about my conversation with Marcus 2 weeks ago? We're an independent K-8 Christian school. We're a few decades old. We're in a key city in a northern region of the province of Ontario. And we just did a beautiful facilities upgrade. We're humming with growth, Deanie. We've got connection with local leaders in the natural resources industry. And we think we've got an educational niche. So we would like to start a high school. Do you think we can do it, he asked. And like William, Marcus said to me, and do you think we can get it up and running by next year? Do we have time for one more story? I'm also thinking of conversations I'm having with Allison. She's the owner-operator of an international shipping company and with several of her friends in a central Ontario area. By the way, all these names and several details are slightly changed just to protect their anonymity. A key priority for this parent group, they said, is that no child should spend more than 10 minutes in a vehicle on their way to school. So we would like to set up a multi-campus hybrid school. Do you think this is possible? And of course, like the others, you know what they're asking me. Do you think we can get it up and running by next September? So many similar stories, so many similar calls. The tone is always tentative, but underneath, I hear a tenacity. All across the province of Ontario and in many more provinces beyond. And as you may expect, there's more to this story that I'm shaping up here. It isn't just parents that are fed up with and making new choices for their kids' education. It isn't teachers or community members or religious leaders who are exasperated with their current options and coming together. Other stakeholders have also entered into the space in serious ways. Philanthropists, researchers, businesses, and governments are changing their posture and becoming involved. So why do these trends matter? Why take the time to identify what they are and try to understand them? Well, they matter because education matters. It matters for our individual well-being, for our civic health, and for our national and our global stability. For our growth, for our flourishing. It matters for our children, for our grandchildren. Everything hangs on this, and perhaps ironically, it all depends on ordinary people recognizing this moment in history and coming together and acting. So, what's our game plan for the next few minutes? I'll begin by outlining and arguing why this is significant. And then I'll build the case for the trends that we're seeing. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. And then I'll build a case for the trends we're seeing. And finally, in the third place, I will conclude with what these trends mean for our current education moment, if this analysis is correct, and what it means for what needs to happen next. And before we begin, I'd like to say a huge thanks to my co-author of this paper, Joanna Van Hoff at Cardus. And I'd like to, Joanna, give a wave. There she is. And to David Hunt and to all the other team members here at Cardus and all the other organizations who have made this evening possible. And I want to thank each one of you who have joined us here in person and those of you that are joining online. You're coming in from all across Canada. I noticed some are here from New Zealand and as far away as well as South Africa. Thank you for every person for taking time to deal with this question. So let's begin with why this matters. In fact, why does education matter? And of course, there are many reasons, but a few stand out, and they stand out to me. And on these, the flourishing of humans and of civilizations rest. Let's start with personhood. First of all, personhood matters because the children we are responsible to raise and educate are persons. They're whole human beings with bodies, minds, and spirits. They're not free-floating, autonomous, isolated beings designed to live some sort of utilitarian existence of and for themselves, alone or even lonely. Rather, they're born in, to, and for relationship with other personal selves and with the non-personal world. For to be a person is to be in relation. Michael Polanyi in 1958 would say, student learning in school is about commitments. Their capacity is to perceive value, to be actively engaged in inquiry, to exercise artful skills, make judgments of belief, to discern patterns and meaning and appreciate beauty, have a passion for and have a joy in discovery. All clearly activities of a thoroughly personal nature. The education of persons, early 21st century Christian philosopher James K.A. Smith would say, is not primarily about the absorption of ideas and information, but it's about the formation of hearts and desires. It's about shaping our hopes and our passions, our visions for the good life. In fact, Smith asks, what if the primary work of education is the transforming of our imagination rather than the saturation of the intellect? What if education wasn't first and foremost about what we know, but about what we love? And perhaps early 20th century British educationalist Charlotte Mason summarizes personhood and its implications for education best when she states that education is about the science of relations and that we owe it to children to initiate an immense number of interests. That is, to build relationships and love for persons past, present, future, for the natural world and for the mysterious aspects of the universe and for the transcendent, for the divine, for God. And to do so through a wide and generous curriculum that would introduce them to the great ideas of history, art, music, architecture, science, mathematics, and poetry. Through it all, the question is not, Mason asks, How much does a youth know when he has finished his education? But how much does he care? And about how many orders of things does he care? In fact, how large is the room in which his feet are set? And therefore, how full is the life he has before him? So education matters because it is the formation and the flourishing of humans that we're dealing with. But there is more. Think Canada for a moment. Our civic posture, our civic organizations, our Indigenous reconciliation, our valuing of our most vulnerable citizens depend on our children being well educated, knowledgeable, moral, and caring. Our moment of constitutional fragility demands that our young are historically knowledgeable and that they are in magnanimous relation with other Canadians, past, present, and future. Our economic prosperity depends on ambitious, innovative, knowledgeable, and virtuous citizens. Employers and leaders building healthy, sustainable ways to live and flourish. Employees committed to good work and innovative ways. And furthermore, Canada needs culture makers, creators of beauty, contributing for now and for the future. And now think global posture. Do we care about being internationally competitive? Do we want to be a society that attractively offers a place for the world's best and brightest to call home? How will we contribute to justice in this world? What will be our participation in or our response to horrific moments of global conflict? Our posture towards human dignity and flourishing of persons, each with inherent, immeasurable God image-bearing value, is pressing. And the stances and the solutions are found in the relations with ideas and knowledge that we build through the education we offer. Personhood, civic formation. Okay, let's talk about trends. Let's talk about the trends that we're seeing, many of which I've hinted at the beginning of this talk. The trends could be understood to be of two types, those inside the fortress and those outside. Allow me to explain. Dr. Paul Bennett, who you've been introduced to and will speak more later, in his work, the book called The State of the System, a reality check on Canada's schools, which I should mention was published in 2020, but just before the pandemic, he reminds us of a model of the Ontario school system that was drawn up in 1993, and he suggests that it still applies to today. It uses the label fortress education to describe the closed system of education in Ontario. And he says the system is divided into insiders and outsiders. So whether you can see or not see what is on the slide in front of you, and we could have a great time quibbling about what should be labeled on some of the bits of the chart, the metaphor of fortress is apt for the phenomenon that we're considering. And we're going to use it here as we analyze some of the trends that we see. So let's look first at the trends outside of the fortress. That's the education space where government is not primarily busy delivering the education. And then we'll look inside the fortress, the public school system. So in our time together, I'd like to build my argument by taking a look at several indicators: trends in enrollment, school startups, including hybrids and microschools, types of independent schools, trends in research and policy, and several other areas that support independent schooling outside the fortress. Our latest data for Canada that is comparable across the provinces is already 2 years old. And some of the stats I'm going to show you will use different years as benchmark years. And that's because I'm trying to use the best data, the best comparable data. So what I can't give you in almost every instance is anything newer than 2021-22 data. But still, it gives us a lot of trends. So by comparing 2021-22 with previous years, we can still learn a lot. This is an important chart. StatsCan gives us the 16 years of data that we can use for the best comparison. So this chart starts at the year 2006 and goes till 2021. Taken all together, all types of K-12 schooling did see enrollment increases, but public schools showed the smallest They increased, that's the line at the bottom, at 4.5% year-over-year growth. The independent school enrollment grew by about a quarter, that is 23.8%, and homeschooling enrollments also almost tripled over the period that we're talking about. Maybe you saw the article in the Washington Post last week or 2 weeks ago. These are the data for the US. Notice how the chart is almost exactly when Joanna and I had just finished creating the chart I just showed you, and then we read the Washington Post article and we saw almost the same chart. The percentages are different, but the direction of the lines are exactly the same. It's incredible growth in enrollments outside of the public sector. Notice as well the increase in independent school enrollments over the last decade compared to public school changes in Ontario. This one shows you Ontario, 22% compared to just 1% growth. And then the sector that I'm most acquainted with is the Christian school sector. We have data from the Association of Christian Schools International in the US that shows a 35% enrollment increase between 2019 and 2022. That is staggering. That follows the lockdowns and the pandemic school closures. The association I'm most familiar with is Advance, and this is some of the data that we were recently able to calculate. So the red line is the data for enrollments in the schools that affiliate with us, but the yellow is the independent school sector. So what you're seeing in all of this is a staggering growth in the last short period in something other than public schools. Okay, let's talk about share of total enrollments. The changes in the share of all students in each sector in Canada also tells a story. Where 93% of students attended public schools in 2006, as of 2021, it had declined to 91%. Now, that doesn't sound breathtaking, but it's the trends. Where 6.6% of students attended independent schools in 2006, as of 21, it was 7.7. Where less than 0.5% were homeschooled in 2006, in 2021, it had risen to 1.2% of all students. Thus, as of 2 years ago, 10% of all students were educated outside of government schools in Canada. Okay, but a lot has happened, as we know, anecdotally from here, and many of you are school heads in this room. You know that enrollments have increased. Staggeringly in the last 2 years. So we don't have the data, but we do have the stories for the last 2 years. We also know that homeschooling enrollments are underreported. So these data are the most conservative, and even they show a significant trend away from government schools. Just have a few more facts that might be of interest to you before we move away from the enrollment section. Independent school enrollment is as high as 13% in British Columbia. Combined with homeschooling, it's nearly 15% educated outside of the government school system. Boundary public school enrollment, excluding separate and francophone schools, is now as low as 66% in Alberta. That means 66% of kids go to their local public school. That means a third go somewhere else. In absolute terms, Ontario has the largest number of any province in the country of independent and homeschool students, and about 8% is the number as of 2 years ago. And homeschooling in some provinces is as high as 3%, for example, in Saskatchewan and Alberta. But credible estimates peg it closer to 6% in the prairie provinces. Okay, enough about enrollments. This is a time, as we've hinted at, of incredible school startups. A decade ago, Ontario showed less than 1,000 independent schools, 954 to be precise. In September 2023, and this I do have good data for, the province of Ontario now has 1,539. So a 61% increase in 1 decade in the number of independent schools in this province. Another fascinating thing about our moment is the new types of schools that are starting. we've caught a glimpse through the conversations I had with William, Marcus, and Allison that I shared earlier. Let's look at hybrid schools, for example. The rise of hybrid schools in the US and Canada is noteworthy. They are schools that combine homeschooling and traditional schooling. So educators typically oversee the curriculum, but they have a very strong relationship with parents. A recent University of Kennesaw study found that not only was there growth in number of hybrids each year, these stats are for 2018 to 2022, but the size of the hybrid schools, the average size, is growing. Interestingly, they are also most likely to classify themselves, that's the big blue part, as religious schools. So the vast majority of hybrids are religious, and students report themselves, you can see the blue as either being homeschooled or the red that they are private schools. So hybrids truly are hybrids. And they're spread in every American state. We don't have similar data for Canada, but we know that the trends would follow here as well. And what about micro schools? The research at an organization called EdChoice in the US estimate that there were more than 1 million children in American micro schools last year. Those are small schools. They often deliver great education in multi-grade settings around unique approaches to education. And these schools are increasing in diversity in multiple ways. So that is, there is increased ethnic diversity among micro schools leaders and among the leaders planning to open micro schools. In fact, 1 in 3 prospective founder of a micro school is Black or Latino. Survey results also show that 70% of micro school founders, listen to this, are certified teachers. They're interested in the opportunity to emphasize specialized, new, and alternative learning philosophies, with half of micro schools offering unique, specialized approaches to teaching and learning. About half of the micro schools in the US, again, very recent data, have a very specialized philosophy, and over a quarter are faith-based. Also interesting to note is that just over a third register as private schools, and almost 45% register as learning centers. So that is another word you're going to hear a lot of, learning centers. In fact, I had an email from someone today. As I was putting the shine on this, we heard from someone, I would like to start a learning center. I'm in this rural area of Ontario, etc. So it's the moment we're in. Types of independent schools. Let's talk about that for a moment. School startups are burgeoning with different types of schools. Different curriculum, different delivery focus, a combination of at-home and at-school being prevalent. We're going to talk about Ontario and Alberta. I've got 4 slides. So Cardus did a recent study called Naturally Diverse. You can get a copy of it on the table. I passed the bar over there. It's called The Landscape of Independent Schools in Ontario. Joanna was also a co-author of that with David. And it provides a snapshot of the increasing diversity of the school types in Ontario. It found that about 40% of independent schools are religious. The other 40% are special emphasis. They found almost 24 different types just within the special emphasis sector. So schools that aren't necessarily claiming religion, but claiming a special pedagogy. Montessori being the most common, but also international baccalaureate, distributed learning, schools that focus on spec ed, nature, and First Nation schools, but also classical schools showing significant growth. And one area that is really growing is schools that focus on arts, sports, or science and tech. Alberta shows a similar spec ed school or special emphasis schools by subtype in Alberta. Special education seems to be the most popular type in Alberta, distributed learning, but then schools that focus, you can see, again, Montessori shows up, experiential learning, and some others. Let's let's talk about the religious aspect of independent schools in Ontario. The Naturally Diverse study also showed consistent increase in the number and size of Islamic schools and Jewish schools alongside its Christian counterparts. In total, more than 100 religious independent schools opened in Ontario just in the last decade, and enrollment in religious schools was up by 24% just over the short period of 2013 to 2019. Alberta recent analysis shows similar, a wide variety of types of Christian schools, growth in the Islamic sector as well. Okay, so much for the types and the variety of schools. Let's move now to considering other trends. Trends in research and policy. More researchers, more think tanks, more institutes are focusing their work on education alternatives. There was a time, not many years ago, when it was almost unheard of for a credible academic to study aspects of education that didn't involve or directly apply to public schools. It no longer raises eyebrows, though, if a top education scholar studies something other than aspects of public schooling. Cardus' own Joanna Van Hoff, she's a doctoral student at the prestigious University of Toronto Faculty of Education, and she's one of many in this new group of scholars in Canada and beyond. Leading think tanks across the US and several in Canada have whole departments focusing on education reform. Taken together, the impact is significant and the presence is felt. One roundup of studies that are currently being done on independent schools and school choice was done by EdChoice, and they have found at least 187 studies conducted on the impact of school choice. And as you can expect, the vast majority of the studies found positive effects of school choice programs. Better education attainment, increased satisfaction, positive fiscal effects, and enhanced school safety. In the last several years, let's talk about government and regulatory changes now. In the last several years, particularly in the US, the regulatory changes opening up school choice to more students and more providers has also been nothing short of dramatic. Becoming baked into the regulatory DNA of the USA, for example, are a vast number of very recent statutory and policy changes, many involving new funding approaches that favor more than just government-designed and government-delivered forms of education. In 2021 and 2022, this chart shows, there were almost 150 new regulations across the US that support school choice. These include education savings accounts, vouchers, tax credit education savings accounts, tax credit scholarships, and tax credits and tax deductions. This is unprecedented change. You can see they've been tracking it over the years. This is a moment where regulation is changing that supports and favors school choice. This is spilling over into Canada as well. 32 states, over 60% of American states have some form of school choice. That is funded. Okay, what about the trend in philanthropy and foundations? This is another trend that is really worth noting. The rise of foundations making significant contributions to the education offered outside of the public system is something that might have escaped our notice unless we pull it all together and see what's going on here. Take the Herzog Foundation in Missouri, for example. They opened in 2020 with $400 million to invest in Christian education. Or the Vela Education Foundation, millions per year being given in grants to catalyze a diverse ecosystem of out-of-system providers. EdChoice. They're the decades-old Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. They produce research, training, and advocacy with significant reach and impact. And there are others, including Stand Together or Foundation for Economic Education. Many more foundations, including family foundations, are aware of the importance of education, and they're directing increased amount of funds to contribute to new innovations in the sector. What about trends in business and culture? More business leaders are paying attention to education as they experience major challenges in attracting the right talent at the right time. Business innovation needs educational innovation. And furthermore, the skill sets that businesses are now seeking in their employees are formed, as we know, in the K-12 settings. Businesses are paying attention, and they're starting to look outside of government-provided education for solutions to their talent needs. Okay. Shall we return to the fortress? We've taken a look at what's going on outside the fortress. Let's take a look at some of the trends in the fortress. Maybe you've noticed some of these articles. The news has been bleak lately. You've seen these articles. When you put them all side by side, and so many of them published in such a short period, it's not an encouraging story. Look at learning loss. We know that the pandemic was a system-changing event. K-12 students have paid a steep price. Poor data collection during the pandemic makes learning loss difficult to quantify, and yet recent Fraser Institute report published in September 2023 was able to look at two provinces, Ontario and Nova Scotia. In both, math scores have declined significantly since 2019, between 2018 and 2021. In Ontario, grade 9 students' performance declined by 23 percentage points in that 3-year period. Only 52% of students met expectations in 2021, compared to 75% just 3 years earlier. Achievement declines, but pandemic learning loss is actually not just a recent trend in the overall picture. Dr. Derek Allison has looked at Canadian students' performance on PISA, which is an internationally standardized test, and his findings also are not encouraging. Overall, since the first years of participating in international testing in the early 2000s, Canadian student performance has been in steady decline in areas of reading, math, and science. These findings are corroborated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission in their Right to Read report that found 1 in 4 grade 3 students and 1 in 5 grade 6 students failed to meet provincial standards for reading. Absenteeism, it's increasing. In the Ontario COVID-19 Science Advisory Table, they reported a 6-fold increase in absenteeism during the pandemic. Both the US and the UK report increases in chronic and severe absenteeism in schools. Violence in school is growing. Violence appears to be on the increase. You've noticed that this year. In May 2023, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario published results of a survey on school violence. With more than 25,000 teachers responding, it showed that 80% of these teachers say that the number of violent incidents in their schools has increased. And 66% of them suggest the severity of the incidents is worse than when they started teaching. And 87% of educators felt that violence has a negative impact on their teaching and on their working, and more than 1 in 3 said that they had to participate in a class evacuation due to a violent incident in the last year alone. Teacher retention. It's increasingly difficult for schools to retain teachers. US data by McKinsey shows 64% of educators who left teaching are doing so voluntarily. It's an increase of almost 10% over 4 years. Recent news reports in Canada decried the shortage of teachers across the country. Teacher burnout and mental health and well-being of educators are real challenges, and maybe some of the reason we're seeing the shortages. Mental well-being and anxiety. Social isolation of the pandemic has had severe impact on students. The Center for Addiction and Mental Health analyzed recent survey responses for more than 2,000 students from grades 7 to 12 from 31 school boards in Ontario, and it found almost 3 of every 5 students said the pandemic made them depressed about the future. More than a third said that the pandemic had a negative impact on their mental health. The stats on loneliness and self-harm are absolutely startling. Indeed, 1 in 5 students seriously contemplated suicide in the past year. This is devastating reality with real consequences for educators and classrooms. The prevalence of dominant ideologies. Headlines have also begun to reveal the contours of an ideological focus that is increasingly of deep concern to parents, to parent communities, and especially to communities of faith. Hostility toward Muslim students abstaining from participating in pride events, wide divides in opinions on sex education curriculum, and the co-opting of school board meetings for the expression of politicized viewpoints have disintegrated the public's trust in the institution. Book bans. And it's perplexing when this disintegration of trust is not recognized for what it is, but instead it's doubled down upon. The recent banning of all books published before 2008 from school libraries in the Peel District is a bewildering response to government directives. It suggests that these ideologies are deeply entrenched and that students are going to pay the price. They will have a narrow curriculum. They will be narrowly read in history and literature and in many other areas. And what is the result of all of this? Taken together, I believe we see a fortress in struggle. So now I'm at the final part of our presentation tonight. Implications of these trends for our current moment. If the trend to more and different education happening outside of the fortress are indeed an established fact, I think we can draw at least one significant conclusion. I would suggest to you that considering all the evidence, we can only conclude that we're leaving an era of educational uniformity and entering an era of educational plurality. This plurality is evident through the diversity of providers, of approaches, of learners, of funders. Pluralism, by definition, does not prioritize or prize one version of education over another. Rather, all are expected to be excellent spaces. What is key is that a variety of secular, philosophical, and religious schools can all contribute to the common good, to flourishing of students, and to healthy civic formation. You might join others, though, and contest me and say, it's not pluralism, but it's tribalism we're seeing, Deanie. Everyone, you might say to me, is searching for their own people, for their own way, and surely this division cannot be healthy. Yet leading education pluralism scholar Ashley Berner from Johns Hopkins University, along with Boston University scholar Charles Glenn, and European scholar Jan de Groef, argue that education plurality is well suited for a polarized time. According to Ashley Berner, there are several core ideas inherent in education pluralism. We'll share 5 here. It is impossible for education to be morally neutral. Therefore, the state has a duty to fund a plurality of options for a diverse citizenry. Secondly, education belongs to the realm of the individual, but it should not be totally privatized, and to the realm of the state, yet it is impossible for a uniform system to meet the needs of all of its citizens. Thus, civil society, consisting of those voluntary institutions core to a healthy democracy, plays an important role in ensuring the quality and delivery of education. Third, education pluralism insists on funding equity, flexible and responsive to the needs of the constituents as possible. Fourth, education pluralism insists on quality. Education is a common good in which neighbors care about the civic outcomes of schooling for one another's children, and thus includes accountability for structures in education. And finally, this civic responsibility includes strong curricula and healthy school culture, both of which are necessary for student success. Thus, pluralism allows for moral difference, it engages civil society to play a role in education, and it insists on equity and on quality, the core of what can hold diverse communities together is pluralism, and thus to avoid balkanization is agreed upon curricular standards, a shared understanding of which core concepts are necessary to know. Pluralism in its most complete form is not just the presence of diverse approaches or tolerance of diverse approaches. It is a system of education in which the government funds and regulates, but doesn't necessarily deliver all forms of education. One Ivy League professor once said, "Diversity is a fact, pluralism is a choice." Indeed, in pluralism, perhaps there is no fortress. Perhaps there are no outsiders. Perhaps there are no insiders. Well, let's summarize and conclude. I've held various roles in education since I earned my Bachelor of Education at the University of Toronto 35 years ago. And I have never seen such real and such material level of interest in education choice. Quite frankly, in all our years of education choice, research, and advocacy, we have never seen this kind of growth and momentum and diversity. This moment in education has no parallel in recent history. And so, if there ever was a time to work together towards accelerating education reform, now is the time. I also sense that this moment cannot be ignored. The momentum left to dwindle, the embers to die out in darkness of more despair, hopelessness, violence, or boredom within the declining monolith that public schooling has become for many students, teachers, and families. You know, I still recall Melissa's email to me earlier this year, asking me to come out to a group of parents who were feeling an urgent need to start a new school. It was so urgent, in fact, that despite the weather, we all drove through an ice storm to meet together. We need a Christian high school for kids in our region, Melissa had told me, and we've needed one here for years. Now is the time. We're going to take 18 months to open, the group told me. We're close to securing a location. Do you think we can get this? Do you think we can thrive, they said, if we especially focus on having a strong co-op program and place special emphasis on getting students prepared for real-world participation? The energy in that room that night was palpable. I'm also thinking about a group of parents with whom I met 6 years ago. Our children are not flourishing where they are, they said. We need to do something differently. Courageously, timidly, and with tireless determination, they opened their independent school with 18 students in 2018. We're at 160 students now, my friend Grant recently shared with me. And with students on our wait list, we now need a site. We need a place to call our home. I'm also thinking about the crying need of refugees and recent immigrants. Parents flocking to a new school startup in Manitoba that opened its doors a few years ago with 8 children of refugees, now has a wait list and is serving 200 students. These are just a few examples. I didn't tell you about the call I had 2 days ago. Not the one today, but the one yesterday. We would like to start a high school in quite a large Ontario city. And will you come out? In fact, will you meet this afternoon? So it's just, what are we to do? What ought we to do? May I propose 3 actions? And in the time that follow these words, I would so value hearing what you think the next possible action should be as well. But I'll propose 3 right now to get us started. First of all, fund boldly. Build into the movement through your finances. Find the organizations best positioned to support the movement and to support the sector overall. Find the foundation best at leveraging funds that can best move funds to where it's needed most and will be put to the best use in this moment. I see 3 places where funding will make a significant difference in the immediate term. First, tuition relief for families who deeply, even desperately desire to choose an independent school, perhaps a Christian school for their children right now, but find the tuition or even just some of the tuition too much of a barrier. Secondly, facilities funding for existing schools that are at capacity and have wait lists so that they can get new spaces designed, built, and opened to new students as soon as possible. And then third, new school startups. Support for them so that the hundreds of groups across Canada that want to open their doors to a new school, a new hybrid, a new microschool, a new learning center, and even by 2024, so that they can get opened and off the ground and running. Let's build into the movement overall by contributing financially to a foundation that is in touch with the needs and the opportunities on the ground and has mechanisms to put things in place efficiently, responsibly, and fairly to distribute the funds where they're needed and will have the most impact. The Christian School Foundation is one of the foundations that has my vote in this regard. Secondly, build vibrancy locally. Build into societal vibrancy by participating in education locally. When a society's education sector is vibrant, all of society benefits. When many citizens create vibrancy in the education space, wrestling with good ideas and approaches and co-delivery arrangements, that's a societal good. Let's get involved in establishing and supporting various manifestations of education excellence. The vibrancy and the vitality of local education communities pursuing different pedagogical or philosophical approaches, experts and ordinary citizens linking arms together, that's attractive. Such nodes of meaning and purpose are vitalizing, they're energizing, they become new places of safe welcome for our children and for our grandchildren. Someone recently called this the subsidiary path forward. Vibrant families, schools, places of worship, community organizations, they're the underpinning of a healthy democratic society. And if you're a person of faith, might vibrant, faith-filled schools take this opportunity to welcome our communities into faith-based spaces? Traditional religious institutions are increasingly inaccessible to people living in a secularized world. Might your vibrant, local, independent, faith-based school become the portal for children of our time to begin flourishing as whole persons? The flourishing that comes when the spiritual dimension of who they are is recognized? In a time of increased immigration, we know many people who arrive in Canada are people of faith. Can you be places of welcome to the religiously committed, a place for newcomers to become established and offer beauty and vibrancy to Canada's schools, communities, and country? Your local involvement in education innovation creates community vibrancy. And more than that, it offers life to children who otherwise would not have such an offer. And finally, advocate provincially. We need you to become ignited in protecting and advocating for forms of education that traditionally operate outside of the fortress. After more than a decade of showing the economic and civic contributions of independent school graduates to the public arena, and many of you are well acquainted with Cardus's education survey findings on the academic, spiritual, and civic outcomes of independent school graduates. It's now time that the discriminatory regulatory barriers against our sector are removed. It's time that governments and policymakers recognize that we are entering an era of education plurality. We need equivalency in this era. The continuing discrimination against diversity in education providers and education design must end. It's worse in some Canadian provinces than others, but all jurisdictions can continue to and learn to remove discriminatory barriers to the flourishing of diverse approaches to education. Our clear message to government and to policymakers needs to be: offer clarity about what the minimum standards are, establish the accountability for all schools to meet, and then give the freedom to pursue them differently. Fund boldly, build vibrancy locally, and advocate provincially. You can be secure knowing that any act you take will not be done in isolation. Your act will be one of many within this larger moment in our time. Taken together, all your acts of funding, building, and advocating will have an impact. Are you ready to join in and contribute to one of the most promising moments in education in your lifetime? We'd love to walk with you in unlocking access to a promising future for your children, for our provinces and for our country.